about the Trump Hotel event, but I missed it.
Yes.
Because he hadn't gone on yet when I left.
Scintillating.
I've been to the hotel a couple times when it was still under construction, but not since then.
Good afternoon. My name is Eric Motley. Maybe you recognize I'm not Walter Isaacson. There are days that I wish I was Walter Isaacson. But Walter was invited by the Secretary of State to join him at the University of Chicago, and he's right now on stage interviewing the Secretary of State. And so Molly was really kind to step in and to help us here, so thank you very much. This is a very interesting season that we find ourselves in, and I was at my desk kind of scribbling some words to a donor, to a large foundation, justifying their support of the Aspen Institute. And so about 65, 66 years ago, a group of individuals came together and they had an idea. And the idea was to create a space, a safe space, so that people of different backgrounds and political ideologies and philosophies could come together to talk about the most important issues of society that impacted our making of the good society, and to engage in civil, enlightened dialogue in pursuit of finding the most viable solutions to those complex issues. And so, up against this backdrop that we find ourselves in now, with a lot of noise, a lot of unenlightened dialogue, and a lot of fussing, the Aspen Institute continues to provide that haven for us to have those type of important conversations. And so I think we're living into our mission. I think we'll have a lot of work to do in bringing people together in the future to address important issues that are not being addressed in this election. And I think a very important way to start that conversation or to continue that conversation is to introduce our panel here today. We have three of the foremost American experts on the political system and the electoral system. And Molly from The Atlantic will introduce our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I, too, am not Walter Isaacson, but I'm delighted to have this conversation today. Of course, Charlie and Amy need almost no introduction, veteran political watchers and prognosticators with the Cook Political Report, which will tell you everything you need to know about politics at any given time. So I am an obsessive reader and looking forward to this conversation. So let's start with the big question. Is the presidential election over? And if so, why or why not? I'll start with you, Amy.
Yeah, it's pretty much over. I mean, there is a possibility that something dramatic can happen in the next 14 days. It's not probable, in the same way that an earthquake or a meteor could hit at any moment. I think that we are looking now, well, at the very beginning, and I'll let Charlie get into the why for a second in a minute, but if you just, at the very beginning of this race, look at what we've been saying was, by picking Donald Trump, what Republicans have decided to do is to double, triple down on the sort of pre-2013 RNC analysis, which that RNC analysis after the 2012 election said, we can't continue to only talk to one group of voters, namely white voters, right? We need to expand our dialogue to include, and our coalition to include, non-white voters. We need more women to support us, especially unmarried women. We need more millennials supporting us. And they chose a nominee who has now has a disapproval rating among all those groups somewhere between 75 and 85%. So they decided, nope, not going to expand the coalition. But he did something else too, which was unique, even for, and I think not anything that the autopsy would have suggested that any Republican do, which is to split the actual Republican coalition itself as well, right? So it's one thing to say, well, we're not expanding the base. We're just going to win on that same coalition that Mitt Romney did by trying to put it on steroids and hope that Hillary Clinton can't get the Obama coalition. But the campaign that Trump has run has also alienated the Romney coalition. Right? So his lack of success with traditional Republican white collar and college-educated voters in suburban parts of the country only further narrowed his path to 270. And that's why we shouldn't be that surprised that we are here 2 weeks out saying, well, it's almost impossible to win, because he's decided from the very beginning of this campaign that he's running the campaign he wants to run, which is a campaign that speaks to the people that show up at his rallies and that voted for him in the primaries. And that has been his MO the entire time. When people say to me, well, do you think he just doesn't want to win? Is he trying to throw this election away? No, I think he absolutely wants to win. But he wants to win it running a certain way. And that's the way he's going to run it. And it gets you a good 40% of the vote. But it doesn't get you 270 electoral votes, and it doesn't get you a popular vote.
Well, and no better illustration of Trump alienating the Romney coalition than the fact that Mitt Romney himself will not vote for Donald Trump, right? But so there's a couple, you posit a couple of different scenarios, right? Some Republicans I know believe, so one school of thought says the Republican Party lost this election the minute they nominated Donald Trump because of what he represents. There's another school of thought that says, well, actually, Donald Trump screwed this up because he ran such an undisciplined campaign. He didn't build a ground game. He didn't sort of behave himself in a manner that would have made him more palatable. Do you think there's a hypothetical Donald Trump campaign that could have won this election, Charlie?
Well, Molly, I was listening to you. I was thinking yes to both. I think in retrospect, Republicans were not going to nominate this year a conventional establishment-oriented Republican. I think, Jeb Bush could have had a different last name and twice as much money, and, Marco Rubio, John Kasich, even Chris Christie, that Republicans just had a burr under their saddle this year. And I thought, actually, the last time you and I were on something, I thought in the end that they would go towards Ted Cruz. They were going to come down to an angry outsider, and I thought that as much as the establishment hated Ted Cruz, that he would be perceived as the more acceptable or the least unacceptable of the angry outsiders, and obviously was proven wrong. But that, if this election, if Republicans had nominated Cruz, I think this race would be dead even right now. If they had nominated a potted plant, they'd be ahead. Let's face it, if this election was a referendum on Hillary Clinton, she would lose. That when you have 10 points more higher unfavorables than favorables, you lose unless you're up against somebody with, say, 22 or 23 points higher unfavorables than favorables. I think we'll probably look back at the first debate, or a combination of the first debate on September 26th and the Billy Bush Trump tapes coming out on September 30th as sort of the defining point, where before that time, the numbers could go anywhere from as close as, I'm not entirely sure it was ever dead even, but Clinton ahead by just 1 or 2, all the way up to 6, 7, 8. But it always seemed to revert to the mean. Always would seem to go back into that 3 to 5, and that seemed to be the default setting. And that's a competitive race where Clinton probably would have won, but it was competitive. And then since then, it just hasn't been. But I think Trump has aggravated his campaign, and his behavior has aggravated a situation that was just barely winnable before. So both of these things, I think.
Yeah.
And what do you see the final margin being, and does it matter? There's going to be a lot of arguments about, and I already hear Democrats and Republicans alike arguing for a landslide scenario to serve as a sort of repudiation of what Trump represents.
Right.
Others saying a close margin will show that Hillary Clinton does not have a mandate to govern. What do you think about that?
The number that I'm really going to be looking for in the exit polls is the percentage of people who say the following. One, the favorable or unfavorable of Hillary Clinton. And it's been somewhat remarkable that despite all of Donald Trump's problems and the fact that she's now in some of these polls ahead by double digits, her favorable numbers haven't really moved very much. Now, in some of the state polling I've seen, she's gone up a little bit, maybe 4 or 5 points, but it's still, as Charlie pointed out, deeply underwater. And whether people feel optimistic or pessimistic about her, I think that was another interesting statistic from the NBC Wall Street Journal poll that came out most recently, where they asked, with this person as president, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, do you feel optimistic with them as president, or do you feel pessimistic? And an overwhelming majority still say pessimistic. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the margin doesn't matter if most people sort of say that I'm still pessimistic about her ability to get things done. I'm also very pessimistic about the chastening factor, that Republicans will look at a blowout scenario. They lose the Senate, the House gets close, she wins 365, 75 electoral votes, and they say, oh boy, well, that was terrible. I guess we should do things totally different this time around, the next time around. I still think the incentive structure within the legislative body, it promotes confrontation and not coalition building, and that's not going to get any better.
I would guess that if the margin's less than 5 points, I will be surprised. And I mean, I'm not a big mandate person, but if it's under 5, I think that would be very, very troubling for her. And so we'd be looking at the margin, would looking at how many states she wins, all that. But I kind of think 2 years from now, it's kind of like the old saying about who on their deathbed ever said, gosh, I wish I spent more time at the office. and I don't think 2-3 years from now she's going to look back and say, gosh, I wish we had gone and tried to win an extra couple states.
Right.
I think instead she's going to be saying, gosh, I wish we had gone after an extra Senate seat or 2. I think that would have been a lot more helpful to her over the next couple of years, is to try to build up a little bit of a margin in the Senate and House, or take over, and to the extent that there's an extra seat or 2 in there. I think that would be a lot more important to her long-term legacy than adding an extra point on the scoreboard or an extra state or 2, because I have to go back and look up, how many states did Ronald Reagan win in 80? I mean, who remembers this stuff other than the 49 states, and for Nixon in 72 and for Reagan in 84? If it's not 49, I don't really remember. I have to go back and look it up. I mean, so that, to me, that's more academic.
Well, we'll talk about the Senate map in a minute, and it does seem like Hillary's doing that now. I was just on the campaign trail with her. She was in Pennsylvania on Saturday, North Carolina on Sunday, New Hampshire on Monday. Those are all battleground states that also have competitive Senate races, and she was with the Senate candidates at all those stops. She's been in Florida, where there's also a potentially competitive Senate race. But I want to stay on the presidential for just a minute. What do you see as the most interesting, for whatever reason, of the battleground states? Are there any unlikely battleground states that you think could surprise us in either direction? Either a state that Mitt Romney lost that Trump still might win, and what does that mean, or vice versa?
Well, I think 4 years ago, I don't know that we would have guessed that Iowa would be almost securely in the Republican column, but we know why. I mean, it's a state with very, very, very few minorities, and while it's a state with a high percentage of high school graduates, a relatively low percentage of four-year college graduates. And basically, if you were going to do a model or formula, as our colleague Ron Brownstein has done, you look at what's the percentage of non-college educated or non-college graduate whites in a state, and that has a very, very highly predictive way of looking at this presidential, much more than in past years. So, Iowa's kind of interesting. That's not one I would have guessed 4 years ago, but now I understand it completely. And I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good one. the fact that we're talking about Utah is fascinating to
Do
me.
you
In
buy
fact, I absolutely do. And in fact, if you've been looking at the polling, and our colleague David Wasserman he kind of grabbed onto this early in the primary season, that where Donald Trump had some real challenges was in these very Republican but conservative areas that were, these were deep, deep dark red. What did he call them? They're high. He had like high and low red. It was basically high education, high Republican propensity, higher income, higher religious, attachment. And so that's why the popular vote margin is going to be interesting, not because she can lose Iowa and still win a bigger percent of the popular vote than Obama did. Sorry, I started to, in my head, conflate people.
Having a Rick Perry moment.
I was really. Now, who's the president? Who is it? Because he's going to underperform in places like Idaho,
Right.
and Utah, and South Dakota, and Texas, right? With those kinds of voters. So you're going to see two things. You're going to see blue states where Obama did well, or held his own in places like Iowa, or the Iron Range in Minnesota, or the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where Trump will do much better, Long Island. And yet, Trump will do worse than Romney in some of these red states. I mean, where's Paul? If Hillary Clinton, one of the more interesting discussions too, the fact that, Hillary Clinton, as you pointed out, is out there campaigning for the Senate seats. Well, Paul Ryan today's up in Montana.
Wow.
Which, remember, Montana used to be a competitive state not that long ago, and they have one House district. But that tells you a little about their worries, right? That Trump is dragging down, even in those sorts of traditionally very deep red states.
My theory is that Speaker Ryan figured he'd see the fewest number of reporters if he went to Montana than anywhere else.
Alaska's next.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned my colleague Ron Brownstein, and one of the things that he's talked about in looking at the map this cycle is that places in the Rust Belt and the upper Midwest may in fact be more Republican now than they were 4 years ago, even as places in the Sun Belt, even states like Arizona, but also Colorado, New Mexico, the Sun Belt gets more Democratic as the Rust Belt gets more Republican. Because of these demographics, which also suggests that the Trump style of appeal does have a bit of an upside. You do gain something in states that have a lot of those white working class voters, but it ends up being a net negative because of the way the population is trending. Right. Do you agree with that theory?
Yeah, I mean, our colleague David Wasserman, and this is translated down to the House, but it said that, for Republicans, is Trump a liability or not? Well, it depends on what kind of district you have. If you have a upscale suburban district, then Trump's definitely a problem. But if you've got a lot of working class whites in your district, well, actually, he could be an asset. And you just sort of have to look beneath the surface and say a state that's Rust Belt, but with a lot of minorities, then that's where Trump will have bigger problems than if it's Rust Belt, but not a lot of African Americans or Latinos.
Well, and I do wonder how long where this trend goes after this election. How much of it is about this election, and how much of it is about sort of broader, deeper trends. And, the Pew study that came out a couple of weeks ago looked at how voters of different demographic groups have been identifying by party over the last 20 years. And the shift from white working class, which in 1992, when Bill Clinton was running, they were evenly divided between Democrat and Republican. And the shift between 2008 and 2016 has been dramatic. Right? Now, this was all pre-Trump. Right? This is during the Obama era. And the shift among college whites, it's shifted, but it's now only about 1 point more Democratic. It's been much slower. So I think that, and I talked to a lot of Democrats about this, their concern is that Hillary Clinton's success with these voters in this election will be important, but ephemeral. And that they're going to go back to their natural resting place, which is with the Republican Party. And Democrats are going to struggle. If they're struggling with white working class voters, they've lost them completely. They can't really feel that they've got white college voters committed to them in the way white working class are to Republicans, they still, to win congressional elections, to win off-year elections, have got to find a way to maximize turnout among groups that don't traditionally turn out, specifically non-white voters and younger voters.
Molly, one of the things, when Secretary Clinton made her somewhat inartful remark about basket full of deplorables, that I think what unfortunately what got lost out was the last part of what she said. And as you remember, that she said, the other half of the Trump vote, and she talked about people that were economically left behind or politically alienated, and she concluded that argument by saying, these are people we need to understand. These are people we need to talk to. And one of the things, and I think it's a relatively safe assumption that she's going to win now, but one of the things I would be looking for in her victory speech on election night and after that is talking to the second half of the Trump voters and to try to talk to these people that feel like they've been economically or politically left behind and dispossessed. And, because this has been, a horrific campaign. While Amy was talking, I was shuffling through my notes to try to find a bumper sticker my daughter gave me that said, Giant Meteor 2016 just ended already, and I couldn't find it. But it has been such a horrible election, and whoever wins this has got to try to pull the country back together and is going to have to try to govern in some pretty tough times with some pretty rough dynamics. I mean, I think Hillary Clinton's job will only be the second worst in town. I mean, that the worst will be Paul Ryan's job.
If he has it.
Yeah.
My favorite campaign swag to that effect, I have a button, don't know how many Lovecraft fans we have in here, I have a button that says Cthulhu 2016, why vote for the lesser evil? But my question is, how much of that sort of attempt at reconciliation and at bringing Trump fans on board can Hillary get away with, given that we have also seen this election season a much more active and vocal left wing of the Democratic Party and a very mobilized racial justice movement that doesn't want to see two parties who see their main job as sort of soothing the tender feelings of white people.
Right.
I mean, is she really going to be able to make that job one when there are going to be so many of the sort of Bernie Sanders crowd who are making demands on her? What do you think?
Well, when Hillary Clinton came into the Senate in 2000, and she talks a lot about her time in the Senate and that she worked across party lines, and that was absolutely true. And if you talk to Republicans who were working with her staff, they felt that she was very easy to work with, and they enjoyed their relationship with her. But let's think back to what the Senate looked like in 2002. You had two Democratic senators from Georgia. You had Chafee, Jeffords in Vermont, right? So two Republicans in New England. You had Voinovich in Ohio. You had, what's his name out in Oregon?
Gordon Smith
in Oregon. So there were plenty of moderate Republicans, and there were conservative Southern Democrats. You have John Breaux and Mary Landrieu in Louisiana. So there were people to actually compromise with. There's nobody left to compromise with. Those people are all gone. So that to me is as much of a challenge as not simply, okay, I got to go soothe the tender feelings of these people, but there are even those people to go reach out to who would be willing to come on board. And that I think is the biggest challenge going forward for everybody, from Paul Ryan to the Senate to Clinton, is you may want to cut deals and get stuff done, but it's the famous John Boehner line that a leader without followers is just a man taking a walk. Right?
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of these folks are just going to be walking around Capitol Hill by themselves.
Well, so that brings us to the Senate, and a lot of the Republicans' remaining hopes for the Senate rest on ticket splitters at this point. The conventional wisdom up to now has been that ticket splitting was a dying phenomenon because people have become so partisan. Do you see ticket splitting making a comeback this year, Charlie?
I think we will see more just because of the weirdness of this year, that you've got such polarizing nominees on each side, that there are people who are normally pretty Democratic who just simply don't like Hillary Clinton. And God knows there are plenty of Republicans that don't like Donald Trump. So I think there may be a little bit more ticket splitting. I don't think it's the beginning of a trend. I think this is just
it's a one-time thing.
Yeah, it's more of an anomalous situation. But, when I look at, I think that this thing has taken a much uglier turn for Republicans within the last week or so. And they're seeing enthusiasm levels of Republican voters go down, which can translate into fewer Republicans are making it through the likely voter screens. So you're seeing Democratic margins start to widen out in a couple of races. And where our colleague Jennifer Duffy has pointed out that for years and years, the Senate seats never split down, the closest Senate races never just split evenly down the middle, that one side generally wins like 75% of them. And this time, it looks like Republicans could be on the worse end of that than the front end, and that when you're looking at the last 6 Senate races, the 5 Republican seats, the 4 Republican incumbents in Kelly Ayotte, New Hampshire, and Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, Richard Burr in North Carolina, Roy Blunt in Missouri, along with the open Harry Reid's open seat in Nevada. With those 5. I think you're going to see some really cross-pressured people, and I think there is something to the argument of don't give Hillary Clinton a blank check. But the question is, how many Republicans are just either going to stay home or will just be so ticked off that they'll be just skipping over a bunch of races?
I do wonder that too. I can't remember what poll this was, whether this was a Wall Street Journal poll that asked, who do you think is going to win? And by the way, asking people, first of all, who you're going to vote for, but then later in the poll they say, all right, well, who do you think is going to win? That has proven to be more predictive. It's now up to 68% who think that Hillary Clinton's going to win, and of that, even 41% of Republicans say that. So those are the people that go, well, I mean,
why bother?
She's going to win. There's no. So I do wonder if that.
They choose not to be part of a coronation
Correct.
Of someone they don't like.
Correct.
Interesting.
Right.
And I should mention the Cook Report recently revised its forecast to project that Democrats will take the Senate majority, a gain of 5 to 7 seats.
Right.
And was there a particular race or a couple of races that hinged on, or was it the general national landscape?
It was several. Missouri's looking increasingly tough for Roy Blunt. New Hampshire. Ayotte was ahead by, 1, 2, 3, 4 points more often than not, and now she's kind of slid back a little bit. But also a more general, a lot of Republican consultants see numbers suddenly that they had hoped they would not see and started seeing, and you saw the the American Crossroads dropping 25 million more into Senate rate, where that was, it's gone to DEFCON 1. I mean, it really has.
Yeah. And you mentioned before the die-off of the dinosaurs, the moderates in the Senate.
Right.
What kind of complexion does
They didn't die, they just retired. We've got some in this room. My old boss, Bennett Johnston, over there. So they're not dead, they're just not actively voting
resting,
in the Senate.
Right?
Well, they either retired or were retired.
Some of them were forcibly
consent.
retired.
Yes,
Many of them
exactly.
were forcibly retired.
Exactly.
But I mean, on the one hand, does it even matter who has the Senate majority by a vote or two, given that you need 60 votes to do most things?
Right.
I mean, what do you think? Is there a big difference in terms of policy and
Well, I think
whether
it's a big difference
Schumer or
in terms
McConnell
of,
is the leader?
I think it's a big difference in terms of being able to, at least theoretically, have an agenda that
Put things on the
put
floor.
things on the table, put things on the floor, control the agenda, control the message in a way that you can't do when you have two groups against you, the House and the Senate both against you. But you're right. I mean, if you talk to voters too, they kind of get the joke. I mean, their assumption is that a Hillary Clinton presidency will just be more of the same. A divided Congress, a Democratic White House, it's going to look a lot like what we see today. And it is, as I said, the incentive structure is just simply not there for compromise. And it goes beyond even the members themselves, but what does it get you to compromise? What it gets you is a primary challenge. What it gets you is, a difficulty in raising money from your online, these people that you get on your phone. And so and you don't even get, since we don't have pork barrel projects and earmarks, you don't even get a bridge out of it anymore. I mean, you used to at least get something. Now it's like,
yeah, well, I mean,
but it matters on budget reconciliation, as you said, controlling the schedule. But the other thing is that this election is just sort of the first act of a 3 or 4 act play, because, if you wanted to, let's say Democrats only pick up 4 seats and it's 50-50, and Tim Kaine moves over to the vice presidency and breaks the tie. Presumably, Governor McAuliffe will appoint maybe Congressman Bobby Scott to the Senate seat. Then he's got to be up in November of 2017, with the same time the governor's race is up. Historically, that's sort of been a bad election for the party in the White House, more often than not, though not the most recent time. So you could see the Senate kind of flip back. And then 2018, you've got it's a midterm election, so turnout dynamics favor Republicans. Would be a midterm election with a Democratic president, so we kind of know how those tend to go. And there are 25 Democratic Senate seats up, 8 Republican Senate seats, so the asymmetric risk, it will be on for Democrats, not Republicans, as it is this time. So this mess could keep going. And one thing might be that for the 15 or so, I think President Clinton will have as big of problems on the left as on her left as on her right. In some ways, having a Senate that's 50-50, give or take, might be somewhat easier than having a whole bunch of more seats, because it would be easier to say no to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and some of these other people that, I know what you want, I know what you'd like to do, and gee, I'd really love to help you, but, the votes aren't there. Sorry, yeah.
Well, what you just said, this mess could continue for a while, seems like a good mantra. I feel like it should be on a bumper sticker. It seems like a safe prediction. But Barack Obama always thought the fever would break. He thought so after 2012. John Boehner thought so after the shutdown in 2013, that at some point the people wanting to touch the hot stove would get burned and figure it out. And it kept not happening. And as you say, the incentives still favor it not happening. Is there any chance that a fever for policymaking breaks out? And the first 2 years of Barack Obama's term, abetted by majorities in both houses, but still, those were by far the most productive years that he had when he enacted most of his landmark legislation. Is there a chance that Hillary Clinton gets that kind of honeymoon?
Well, I would argue the first 2 years of President Obama's administration, they were most productive from his standpoint and the most destructive in terms of the presidency and his presidency in a lot of ways. I don't want to sound like a gloomy Gus. I think there are some things that may get slightly less dysfunctional. I personally, I came here in September 1972. Presidencies usually work better when you have a president that's willing to, say, sit down with members of Congress or pick up the phone and call them without having an arm broken. We've gone 7.5 years without a president, with a president that hasn't liked to be around members of Congress, doesn't like talking to them.
Can you blame him?
Yeah, actually, I
know.
do.
I'm teasing.
I think this is a people business. I think if you don't like people, you shouldn't have gotten in it. I have a friend, a former Democratic congressman that said, and I'll clean up the language for C-SPAN and Aspen Institute purposes, but said, you know, the problem is Obama thinks that politicians are lower than whale poop and that he's not one of them and he doesn't like being around them and it'll rub off. And, you know, if that's what your own side's saying, you know, imagine how the other side must feel about you. So I think, as Amy was talking about, when Hillary Clinton was in the Senate, she had good relations with members on both sides of the aisle. The second thing is watching the Senate the last couple of years, with Republican leader Mitch McConnell, Democratic leader Harry Reid, it's been like watching two scorpions in a bottle. I mean, the words despise and loathe really understate the situation. And I think, you know, Chuck Schumer is going to be the next Democratic leader, majority or minority. Chuck Schumer is a partisan Democrat, and as everyone in this room knows, he's a bit of an acquired taste, but I don't think there's any question in the world. He will have better relations with Mitch McConnell. He will have better relations with Republicans in the Senate. You know, I've always thought of Schumer as kind of a New York version of John Breaux. Although I saw Al Franken referred to him as a Jewish LBJ. I'm having a hard time getting my arms around that one. But here's a guy that likes to do deals, that likes to do stuff, you know, and I think one of the top things, I mean, I think she'll probably lead with infrastructure and tax reform, working closely with, you know, Paul Ryan and Schumer and Orrin Hatch and some of these folks. But the other thing is the Affordable Care Act. I mean, it's not going to get repealed, but man, it's going to be unrecognizable. And it's got to be total overhaul. And I think having a president that doesn't have ownership of it is probably a good thing. And somebody doesn't have a proprietary interest and see it as the product of an immaculate conception that should never be tampered with. Exaggeration, but not that much.
It seems to me, you know, the question is always how much of a proactive administration do you have or reactive, right? And some of it is completely under your control. If there's a war that breaks out, huge disaster, natural disaster, you have no control over that. But Charlie's right. She has a couple of things on her plate before anything proactive can happen. One is the Supreme Court, assuming that it doesn't get done in this lame duck. So that's going to take up a good amount of time and energy, and you know that, and it'll be very contentious and difficult. You know, you have the debt ceiling again. Woohoo! Yay! We get to talk about government shutdown. CNN should just start running their clock right now, right? Just like X number of minutes until the next fiscal cliff. So we're gonna deal with that. You got to deal with the Obamacare situation. And that's all before we start talking about let's do tax reform and infrastructure and all these other lovely things that people would like to do, on top of the fact that things around the world could get much worse than they are and are likely to do so.
Well, and another obstacle to any Democratic president coming in would be a Republican House. And this particular Republican House has had a lot of challenges. First of all, what do you see as the prospects for the House majority? Is it as far-fetched as it's always been for Democrats? And then second of all, even if his party keeps the majority, does Paul Ryan keep his job?
Well, I mean, I think I had thought for a long time that the over and under in the House was sort of 13 seats. That's what Republicans picked up in 2014 over what had happened in the last presidential election. I think the chance of that going north of 13 is pretty good, and could start pushing 15 to 20, and which starts slicing the House pretty thinly. I think what's really important is which Republicans lose or aren't coming back, and to the extent that they're disproportionately establishment, conventional kind of John Boehner, Paul Ryan kind of Republicans, that means the center of gravity within the conference moves to the right, so Ryan's job gets more difficult. But, you know, at the same time, the thinner the slice of the majority, you know, I might wonder whether some of the more exotic members, the Freedom Caucus people, whether at some point just sort of basic fourth you have a fourth grader, arithmetic might start setting in where they realize that this is, that they're not going to get anything
better than that.
anything like what they want. So I don't know. And then the scenario that scares the hell out of me is, I've been thinking this for a while, but a week ago Friday, there was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal on page 2 that pointed out that this period of expansion, as anemic as it is, started in June of 2009. So we're in our 88th month of expansion. It's the fourth longest since they started keeping economic records in 1850. We've never had a recovery expansion go more than 10 years. And I know that economists say that expansions do not die of old age, but I do suspect they get a little anemic after old age, and this is a particularly weak one with all of our major trading partners having challenges and the Fed not having many arrows in its quiver. Kind of hard to drop interest rates much beyond, and a political system that's fairly dysfunctional. So no matter who wins the presidency, the odds of a recession in the next 2 or 4 years are pretty darn good. So
Yay.
Yay.
and somebody really wants this job.
Well, and so you sort of sketched a scenario where the silver lining of a smaller House majority for Speaker Ryan could be that it puts the fear of God into some of, as you put it, the more exotic members. I guess the alternate scenario is that it's a double whammy for Speaker Ryan. The smaller his majority, not only is it harder then to get them all on the same side of a vote, but the more it is dominated by these members from dark red districts who belong to the Freedom Caucus or are sympathetic with it or are just afraid of a primary challenge from someone like that. And we do already hear some rumblings about trying to depose the speaker.
No.
If you're Paul Ryan, how depressed are you?
Well, this has always been the challenge to me, to the anti-Ryan forces in Congress. They're always there. They're very vocal. They have no leaders, right? And I always ask the follow-up, oh, it's not Paul Ryan. Who is it? Is it maybe you? No, I'm not. Is it going to be you? No. All right, there are no names. It's just he's not going to be there. And so I guess he's going to be replaced with just a mysterious figure that's where he's going to emerge from somewhere. They like being antagonists. They don't want to be leaders, right? So that's very different than having two factions. You know, that's sort of normal, right? You have two political factions. They battle for supremacy. One wins, the other loses. I think the bigger question, too, is what happens to that whole caucus. We kind of call them the vote no, pray yes, right? That they're voting no, but they're not the real hard Freedom Caucus types. They're voting with the Freedom Caucus because they can get away with it and they don't want to rock the boat and they don't want to get a primary and they don't want to have to explain why they are supporting the terrible, awful leadership.
But they kind of know this stuff's
But they
nutty.
know that it needs to get done, okay? And they know that we can't have another government shutdown, we can't have a fiscal cliff, we can't do blah, blah, blah. They are actually in a much tougher spot now because when you have 5 seats, you can't hide.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of them have been caught in the middle of the Trump whirlwind too, right? Because they do have two factions of their constituency sort of forcing them to choose sides. I was at a Trump rally in the Florida Panhandle shortly after the Billy Bush tape came out, and most of the Alabama delegation, we were closer to Alabama than we were to Miami by a long shot, and I met a woman from Alabama who said, you know, my Congresswoman Martha Roby disendorsed Trump, and I was so angry at her, and I sent her a letter. And so you did have a lot of these people, even in red districts, really torn between the two factions of the Republican Party. Literally could win re-election, but were sort of hamstrung by that. What does that mean going forward? Is that,
You know, the speaker doesn't have to be a member of the House. They can elect Donald Trump speaker.
hey, he is going to need something to do after the election.
And if you're not a member of the House, are you exposed to the Ethics Committee? I don't know. This has just all kinds of interesting questions.
Uncharted territory.
Charlie, good.
Yeah, thanks.
That's a headline.
But where do you see that? I guess what I'm asking is, where does that energy
Where does it go?
That has propelled Trump? Is it unique to him? Does he make any effort to take it with him, to turn it against leadership, as he has been doing lately, talking about Paul Ryan almost more than he talks about Hillary Clinton in his stump speeches? Does he simply try to put it to commercial use? What do you think? Or does it just die out without someone?
One thing, and this is not a prediction because I'm skeptical about whether this will happen, but the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a lot of conservative evangelicals just lose heart and just sort of gradually lose interest in politics, become less engaged. There is a possibility that sort of the Trump/Tea Party folks, they chased the car, they caught the car wrecked, mixing all kinds of metaphors, but that maybe they start pulling back and the more conventional Republicans can take back over. I say that, and I think that's pretty wishful thinking, actually. But I don't think that's going to happen. But it's conceivable that this just wasn't the cruise they signed up for, and pulled back some.
So when the car crashes, what happens to the dog? Does the dog die? Does the dog limp away and look for another car? Or does the dog figure, maybe I shouldn't chase cars anymore?
Yeah. Or this brought to you by the Humane Society of America. This
we're all pro-dog.
We're all
Nobody wants the dog
always lives, right? We don't want to do that. The other thing I think about, though, Molly, is that what we obsess about at the time suddenly becomes not as relevant a month or 2 months, because again, we're always in whatever is the next thing. And while I don't think the Trump thing is going away with it, as soon as the election's over, I think we may be, because we're so fascinated with it, we may be overselling its duration. The Republican Party has been fractured for many, many years. It started long before Donald Trump. It's not his fault that the party's fractured. In fact, I would argue it started under George W. Bush when he pushed through the prescription drug the prescription drug Part D Medicare legislation that I remember sitting with Mike Pence at the time, who was furious about this, right? Republicans don't expand entitlements. The No Child Left Behind bill also infuriated a lot of conservatives. The other fiscal conservatives really upset during the era of Tom DeLay and Dennis Hastert and the earmarks and the doling out the cash to help protect their majority. Then after the Iraq War started, the split within the party that gave you Ron Paul and the rise of the libertarianism. And then the Tea Party comes along in 2010, which was in part about Obama, but was as much about their frustration with their own leadership and not stopping Obama from doing stuff. And so this has been a fractured party for years and years and years, and Trump is adding one more element to it. It's just really hard for a party out of the White House to find a center, right? I mean, that is just a unique thing about the American political system. There's not, like you have in some other countries, where you have an opposition leader and then you have the leader. It is just amorphous, and then you get the White House and you can kind of get your act together.
But listening to your litany of problems facing the Republican Party, and I agree with every one of them, but I've always thought that whenever you see a problem in one party, take a look over the other side, and there's either the potential, if not the reality of that. And, I think, you've got Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, and as far as they're concerned, the Democratic Party is owned by Wall Street and the big banks, which is news to Wall Street and the big banks, because they're certainly not getting value for their ownership. But I think that the center grabbing the Democratic Party, I do think it's now closer to Sanders and Warren than it is to Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden.
Yeah.
And so, I'd say look at all the horror show things going on in the Republican Party, and to some extent, it could be a preview of coming attractions for Democrats. So,
I want to push back on that a little bit, because I agree that there are a lot of potential fissures in the Democratic Party, but Hillary Clinton won the Democratic primary. A lot of progressive candidates who sought Senate nominations in this cycle and in previous cycles have not succeeded against either incumbent candidates or establishment candidates to get those nominations. I keep looking for this sort of Tea Party of the left to arise, and it keeps falling short. And both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are now enthusiastically campaigning for Hillary Clinton. So I think there's the potential for splits there, but I just don't think they're at least currently in nearly as much of a mess as the Republicans are.
Well, I think Donald Trump has been the great unifier for a lot of these factions within Democrats, but I think these warm and fuzzy feelings towards Hillary Clinton that Warren and Sanders and their backers have, I think they've got a shelf life of about 2 weeks. And then, but you sort of look around folks that are already in the Senate, and then you throw in Russ Feingold's coming back, and, fair chance Deborah Ross. Gosh, we've never had an ACLU person in the Senate before, and, you've got all kinds of really interesting people that may be coming in, and
I think, yeah, I agree with that, and I'd also say a couple other things. When you ask Democrats why there hasn't been sort of this similar breakup, part of it is just a fundamental distinction between what the sort of rebels on the Democratic side versus the rebels on the Republican side are looking for. I mean, at their core, the sort of Freedom Caucus, Trump portion of the party believes that the government is we need to just blow all of this up because government is at its core the problem. Whereas liberals are saying, no, we need to use government better to fix problems, right? So they're never going to want to blow it up in the same way that Republicans want to blow it all up because they want government to actually do stuff. The other thing that's also been clear is that just on policy issues, the Democrats, at least on social and cultural issues, are not nearly as divided as Republicans, and that's been helpful so that they all agree, if you look on issues, immigration, gay marriage, climate, guns, almost 100% agreement within the full Democratic constituency versus the Republicans where they're all over the place. Trade's been that one tension point, but even if you look at polling on trade, I think a lot of it is directed at the fact that is about the fact that it's a Democratic president pushing TPP, but Democrats are much more positive about trade and trade agreements than Republicans. And so I think you are right in the sense that there aren't some of those classic hot button issues like Republicans had in trying to push immigration through a recalcitrant Republican electorate, but where Democrats and what I found fascinating about Hillary Clinton is, yeah, she did win the primary, but she did so in many ways by having to run to the left of Joe Biden, to the left of her former boss, President Obama, and by repudiating much of what her husband accomplished. DOMA, NAFTA,
The crime bill,
welfare reform, right? Those are the pillars of the Clinton presidency that she had to either completely repudiate or move to the left of.
You mentioned immigration. Do you think there's any prospect for immigration legislation, given what a hot button it was in this presidential cycle?
If I were her, I'd stay the hell away from it for at least 6 months. I would try to stay on infrastructure tax reform and health care, and maybe try to slide, if Merrick Garland doesn't go through on the lame duck, try to put him back through early on, without a divisive fight. But I'd say if I were her, I'd try to stay the heck away from any real polarizing left-right issues for certainly the first 6 months, and to try to not do what happened in 2009. To use 2009 as a model of what not to do.
Or do Republicans have an incentive to bring up immigration? It was thought that they had one after 2012, and then that ran into the dirt for a whole lot of reasons. Yep. But I know a lot of, maybe this is just the Beltway Republicans set, but I certainly know a lot of Republicans who wish they would have pushed it through back then and gotten it off the table.
Absolutely. That was the whole point was, yes, Eric Cantor lost, and I know you're scared thinking you're going to come next because it was about immigration, but if we don't do this now, it's only going to get worse. It's that whole take your medicine now or end up in the hospital later. And, they're choosing to risk it. Look, there are more Republican voters out there who'd be willing to go along with some form of immigration reform than we talk about. It was obviously a motivating issue for many voters, but I was listening to a focus group yesterday in North Carolina, and these are Republican-leaning voters. Every single one of them, not every single one, let's say half of the room, when they asked what was the one issue about Donald Trump that really made you angry or, sort of turned you off, and it was the wall, right? This is not a consensus view among Republicans that immigration reform is terrible. It's that there is a significant group of Republican voters that believe that it's terrible, but getting it through is the challenge.
I'm not one of these people that yells at the TV set during debates. My wife is, but I'm not. But I was having a conversation with the TV set during the last debate because Trump was trying to be mischievous and was saying, well, President Obama has deported millions and millions of illegal immigrants in the last couple of years. And I wanted Hillary Clinton to say, or somebody to say, so are you saying you agree with President Obama?
Right.
And where's the conflict here? But nobody called him out on it. But I thought it was kind of interesting. He was trying to have his cake and eat it too.
Well, it is interesting because, I've been seeing polls for years that show that, depending on how you word the question, but even a majority of Republican primary voters agree that there ought to be immigration reform and there ought to be some sort of legalization, and that we ought not to stick with the status quo. We ought not to deport everybody. There have even been polls this cycle that showed that a majority of Donald Trump supporters in the Republican primaries didn't think you could build a wall or should build a wall. And yet there seems to be some kind of cultural activation that comes from talking about this issue that, I talk to Donald Trump supporters at his rallies who say, I don't want to build a wall. I don't think we should build a wall. But when he's willing to talk about things like that, that's gratifying because it shows he's willing to go to those places.
To me, there are two different things that have happened in the parties. And part of it is that if you took the Democratic Party of the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, and if you sucked out about 80% of the conservatives out of the Democratic Party, and you sucked out about 80% of the liberals out of the Republican Party, part of that's what happened. But the other part is if you took 40, 50% of the moderates in the Democratic Party or moderates in the Republican Party who used to play a really influential role, and they just they didn't go away, but they just kind of moved on an inactive roster, and they no longer play an influential role within the party. And the fact that, to me, the Democratic Leadership Council literally doesn't exist anymore.
Right. They close their doors.
Literally doesn't. It's the things that were the balancing in both parties are either aren't there or just don't have much juice. Yeah. And so that you could have an opinion that could be reasonably widely held among Republicans, but if it's in primary voters, not so much.
Well, and good luck raising money too. Mm-hmm. That's the other piece that we've learned from this election is that, the party structure itself is not going to help you in the way that it once did. There was a time when if the party said, we're not going to help you fundraise, or we're going to shut down your money, or we're going to make sure you don't have access to donors, that was a death blow to your campaign. Now you just pick this up and you get your donors. Mm-hmm. And so the normal referees are gone. And so, again, I always go back to, it's probably because we have little kids, but I always go back to incentive structures, right? Like if you're not giving the incentive for the behavior, then they're not going to exhibit the behavior. And so when your incentive is obfuscating is what gets you votes, then you're going to do that. When you say, well, doing the right thing doesn't get me anything, it doesn't get me an earmark, it doesn't get me even a pat on the back, then there's there's no reason to do it.
I want to go to questions in a little bit, so start thinking of interesting things to ask our panel. But first, when we look out at the map that is likely to result from this election, wild cards like Arizona, Utah, maybe even Texas, the best case scenario that you hear Democrats talk about is that this isn't just a one-time affair. This is setting off a long-term realignment where a new group of particularly minority voters have been not just activated, but have cemented a loyalty to the Democratic Party. Look at like Latinos in Arizona, for example, and therefore there's a long-term effect that makes it harder for Republicans to win that state again in the future. The Republicans would like to believe that Trump is an anomaly and that all of this effect dissipates after the 2016 election. We go pretty much back to the status quo ante, or maybe even better for them considering the unpopularity of the new Democratic president. Which of those sides do you fall on? Do you think there's long-term fallout from this electoral campaign?
I guess the question I would ask is, who does a better job of addressing their problems? Do Republicans sort of staunch the bleeding among Latino and Asian American voters? I think the gap's too big and permanent, really, for African Americans. Or do Democrats with non-college educated whites, and particularly non-college educated white males, whoever does a better job of repairing damage with the group that they're in deep trouble with, I think is going to come out of all of this much better off. And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, when I talk to a lot of Republican leaders, they're smart people, and they know. I mean, the autopsy, the RNC autopsy from 2013. If probably 10 or 12 of the 17 Republican candidates won the nomination, they would have gone along with the autopsy. But not the ones they did. But they're smart people, but you saw, as Amy said, what happened when Eric Cantor took a baby step on the DREAM Act and was decapitated for it.
Right.
And I don't think anybody missed that.
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't know either, because I think we have seen there's still a real fluidity among millennials and Latinos about party identification. Even if you look at the registration in North Carolina, a fast-growing state, diversifying state, lots of young people moving in there, and the under 20, I guess it's under 40 millennial officially, right?
Under 35.
Under 35
Yeah.
millennial. It's the registration has been overwhelmingly, they register non-party, right? And they're doing that for a reason. I mean, I don't think that they are doing that simply because they're just trying to, prove something.
Mm-hmm.
I think they are truly not identified with the party. Now, they're identified with certain policies that Republicans continue to vote for them the wrong way on, especially on social and cultural issues. But I think that there are a number of issues in which they could find a home. But, we've found in past that, who you grow up voting for, your cohort, when you first come into voting age, you usually stick with them.
It's sort of
during your life.
imprinting.
It's sort of
that occurs,
imprinted
yeah.
in. If you were like Gen X, we were the Reagan kids, and versus the Obama kids and guess what? Those Obama kids keep growing up, and the Reagan and Eisenhower and others keep getting older, and as that goes through the pipeline, it gets harder and harder to switch them over to Republican.
There's a political scientist I was speaking to recently who actually studied the difference in party loyalty between different generational cohorts, people looking at the data based on people's birth dates. Mm-hmm. And what he found is that this imprinting effect actually happens before people start voting. It's who's in power when you're about 15 that makes the most impression on you. And so, I not to toot my own horn, but I recently wrote a piece on theatlantic.com about older voters who are the most loyal group to Donald Trump, despite this sort of, I think, conventional wisdom that he's sort of a working class candidate. It's actually retirees who are his strongest supporters. And so much of his campaign is about some combination of nostalgia for the 1950s, make America great again, go back to a world before the cultural revolts of the 60s and all kinds of things like that. And then also, he was the only really Republican candidate strongly arguing against entitlement reform, saying we shouldn't do anything to Social Security or Medicare. But the point of that just being that these are these things that occur in the electorate do tend to be long term because voters have long memories and they carry things forward. And the big question, I think, which you sort of were talking about, we have an American population that is increasingly partisan. There are fewer and fewer voters who truly swing between the two parties. People's loyalties to the Democratic and Republican candidates are more cemented than ever, and voters are more ideological than ever before. Democrats are liberals and Republicans are conservatives in a way that was not the case even 20 years ago. On the other hand, people are less and less loyal to the parties as institutions. Right. Conservatives increasingly are unregistering from the Republican Party. They don't feel that the GOP represents them. Young people don't have any use for the Democratic Party. It's uncool. They consider themselves individual and independent. And so I wonder how those two trends somehow come into collision, and if we are on a course for some kind of disruption, maybe not of the two-party system, but of the institutions of the political parties right now.
I wish they would add a crosstab of when you turn on the television and watch anything involving news or current events or public affairs, what channel do you watch? And, I think there are a whole lot of white guys over 60 sitting in the Barca Lounger watching Fox. A lot. And I know there are a lot of people that were, pretty conservative before. But boy, you get them 4 or 5 hours watching that stuff, and their views start getting a little more exotic. And I'm sure, the same thing with Rachel Maddow, and would be on that side, would do the same thing. But it's, I think you could see some personality changes.
Well, and
to your point, though, about I think this is a fascinating question because I think we've already seen. Actually, let me put this into a bigger context. To me, it sort of dovetails with the question about: are we going to see like a third-party system? Right? Is that what you're saying? Like that we'll have an ultimate disruption, and that the parties are going to split up when we're going to have multiple parties. But I think we've already had that this year, which is we have a presidential nominee for the Republican Party who's not really a Republican, right? And he identifies on issues that are traditionally Democratic, or you could argue not in the Republican orthodoxy. He's attracting people that are certainly Republican, strongly Republican, but also some that aren't. And he came without the blessing of the Republican establishment, and he has thwarted them at every turn. So I think that's more likely what you end up seeing, and Bernie Sanders was the same way, of course, on the left. He literally is not a Democrat, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's not just like he's still not a Democrat. And yet, he got a lot of votes from Democrats, and he raised a lot of money without any help from anybody within the Democratic establishment. And so what I think you're going to see is instead of having a third party, it's just third parties within the two parties, and more of those candidates kind of come and go, and there's nobody to sort of put them in their place like there was in the old days.
All right, we are ready for questions. If I can just ask, when you ask your question, wait for the microphone, tell us who you are, and please try to ask a question rather than giving a speech. Let's start all the way over here.
There being no one left to pass it to, I'll take it. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I thank you, by the way, for this wonderful conversation. We haven't talked about turnout, and I'm interested to know what you're thinking on that subject is, and to the extent that there is either a data point of view or a well-developed point of view from all the time that you've spent out in the field, what you think the turnout factor will be in this election, whether it could be more of a determining factor than we might anticipate, and if that's the case, where will it have its greatest impact? At the presidential race level, at the Senate and or congressional levels?
It's a great question. The question was about turnout. Could everybody hear it? About what we expect for turnout. I've been watching the early voting numbers, and what we see so far is that as of yesterday already, about 8 million votes have been cast in the states that have early voting, which is an increase of quite a bit, 20 or 30% over 2012. And it does appear to be, it's mixed in different states. States with strong Republican machines, Republican governors, like Ohio and Iowa, the Republicans' early voters seem to be stronger, in part because Donald Trump has no campaign to speak of, so he's reliant on local Republican apparatuses, which vary dramatically from state to state. But it does appear to be relatively imbalanced. It does appear that Democratic constituencies are the ones flocking to the early voting. I personally would not have been surprised to see this be a very low turnout election overall. You do have so many disenchanted partisans on both sides. You do have so many people feel disaffected in both parties. But what I think we're starting to see is that the disenchantment is much more severe on one side than the other, and we may, in fact, have a very high turnout election. What do you think?
Let me give the answer that I would have given prior to 3 o'clock on September 30th, the day the Billy Bush tapes, the time the Billy Bush tapes came out. Up until then, I was thinking that I thought turnout would be fairly normal. And it would be normal because while, yes, you had fewer voters that were enthusiastically for one or the other candidate, you had a heck of a lot of people that were very enthusiastically against one or the other. And a vote's a vote, whether you're voting against somebody or for somebody. And there were a lot of people that just wasn't going to be able to sleep at night if they didn't turn out and vote either against Hillary Clinton or against Donald Trump. And so I thought that we were going to have fairly normal. I think that when the race started taking on a smarmier turn, then to me the danger of turnout starting to come down started, getting more and more real. So now I would not be as surprised if it was low turnout than I would have been before the tapes came out. The other thing, though, is that to me it's a matter of what we'll be looking for is what is the highest and what is the lowest vote total for any office in a given state. Because I think we are going to have people skipping over offices and either skipping over the presidential, or maybe they're voting the presidential, they're Republican that's upset because, either their senator or congressional candidate either did or didn't disavow Donald Trump. I think you may be seeing people sort of hopscotching around the ballot a little bit more. So I'm a little more towards the lower than I was then.
When I was in Arizona a few weeks ago, I met quite a lot of Republicans who were going to vote for Donald Trump and not John McCain, and quite a lot of Republicans who were going to vote for John McCain and not Donald Trump. So.
Case in point.
Well, let's go to more.
All right, let's come over this way, all the way to the front.
Thank you for your time here. I'm Joanna Brignolo. I'm interested in knowing, are there any Arthur Vandenberg types existing in either party, and what do you think that there could be some hope for? I know you've mentioned that you think the people are gone now, but I mean, humanity is really wanting precision in accomplishment in our government. And so otherwise we do face a huge rebellion coming.
Yeah.
Arguably, we already are seeing it. Amy, what do you think about that question?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it is quite the paradox, which is, if you sit down into any group of voters, and ask them what's the number one problem in Washington. It's that they don't get anything done, right? Nothing gets done, totally dysfunctional. And then you say, okay, well, at the same time, you ask a lot of these voters, and Charlie's written about this, in the Republican primary in Iowa, they asked voters, well, do you think that Republicans in Congress have compromised too much or too little with Barack Obama? And 81% of Republicans said they compromised too much. Okay?
59% in New Hampshire and
Like
72% in South Carolina.
Okay.
Republican voters.
So we want them to get it done, but we don't want you to compromise. Okay, exactly right. Now, we are humans, and just our thinking is always flawed. Okay, we do not think logically. We rationalize about everything that we do. Right? Oh, I can have another cookie. I think that I walked like 20,000 steps today. No, you didn't. But you can, whatever you want to rationalize, you can. And so that's how I think we are working. We are becoming more frustrated with the process than ever. And yet, as Molly pointed out too, we are more polarized than ever at the same time. And so that piece of it, and this desire to kind of like always be on the winning side, compromise is losing, I think is seen not just in Washington, but just it's kind of the way that the world also works these days. So look, I don't want to believe that this is the only way that we break it, but we have not had a real crisis moment in this country in a long time to bring us together. And it was interesting, like a Great Depression, like a World War, not, 9/11 was traumatic. The 2008 financial crash was traumatic, but it did not impact everybody somewhat equally. I was talking to a guy the other day who's African American, and was noting about the city that he's in now, how much more racially charged it was than where he grew up in Galveston. And I said, well, why is that? He said, well, because we had hurricanes all the time in Galveston, you had to be friends with your neighbors. Because at some point you were going to need their generator, or their power was on and yours wasn't, right? And so you needed something out of the refrigerator. And that forced, we might not have always been, we wouldn't have been friends otherwise. But now if you have enough money, he said, you can insulate yourself. You don't need anybody. And that kind of feels like that was a great way to think about where we are, I think.
I suppose that 40 years ago, people in this town were saying, well, it was better in the old days. Yeah. And maybe they were. But, when I think of the last 10, 20 years, 25 years, the caliber of people whose retirement parties I've gone to has been a hell of a lot higher than the swearing-ins. The folks at the swearing-ins. I mean, a big old gap. And actually, I was a month or so ago. I was on the Hill, and I had met with a Republican congressman who I had never met before. And what the hell? His name was Greg Harper from just outside Jackson, Mississippi, and Republican Energy Commerce Committee. And I walked out of his office thinking, wow, he's kind of like the members we used to see. He was really conservative, but rational, reasonable, and the kind of guy that could be a really effective member. But it made me nostalgic meeting this, relatively junior member, because he represented what used to be, pretty common, and it's disillusioning. And I think the incredibly negative and invasive nature of campaigns today has something to do with it. I think fundraising has a lot to do with it. I think terribly invasive media coverage and snarky reporters who play gotcha all the time. All these things have combined, and the loss of community here in this town have all sort of contributed to the place just, Congress was never efficient, but it was productive. And,
Let's go right there in the back, all the way. Yep, you, sir.
I'm Adam Clymer. I used to cover politics in this town.
Wow, with the beard, I didn't recognize you, Adam. Wow.
Well, I've tried to, witness protection.
Never know when you'll see Dick Cheney, huh?
We're talking about going fishing someday. Two things which I think are related. You've gotten from 4 or maybe 5 to up to possibly 7 seats in the Senate. I'm curious as to what the last 2 were, and also, and I think they're related. Do you think the Republicans will filibuster any Supreme Court nominee who isn't committed to the Second Amendment as seen by David Keene?
Great question. You want to start with
You
the
go
Supreme
ahead,
Court? Charlie, what do
Well,
you think?
yeah, I'll go with the last one first. I can see, I think, if the Senate goes Democratic, and I think it's, 60-40, 65-35 chance that it does, I think that they're going to look at Merrick Garland as probably the best deal they could get. Now, the question is, if they lose the Senate, I would be somewhat inclined, if I were McConnell, to say, you know what, we don't want to confirm him, but if you put him back up after we lose our majority, we will not beat him. In other words, they wouldn't want their fingerprints on the trigger as having helped him get confirmed, but they're not going to lay across the railroad tracks either, because I think that they've climbed out on a limb that's kind of hard for them to get back on, but I think they know that he's a lot less worse than they expected, a lot less worse than it could be. He's somewhat older than, if a Democratic president put a 55-year-old on the court. But I think they may have to wait till after the first of the year and have Clinton putting back up. And from her standpoint, I would think, first of all, I think would be perfectly fine with him. But secondly, the last darn thing she wants is a divisive Supreme Court pick. So, that's sort of what I think is going to happen, may happen. What are the last ones? If Republicans went from losing 4 to 7 or 4 to 6, Indiana would probably be one of the last ones to go. Indiana, maybe North Carolina, maybe Nevada. Those would be the last 3 as opposed to the first group.
You think those are closer than Missouri? Or is Missouri also in that group?
I consider Roy Blunt a friend. I think his chances of coming back are not real great.
Wow.
And then that's with Trump winning the state fairly handily. But I think a lot of the Trump anti-Washington, anti-politician stuff out there, it's kind of working against, I think somebody wrote a piece the other day that was working against both Roy Blunt and Evan Bayh, and I buy that, but I think Evan started off in a, maybe a little bit better position, but we'll see.
On the Supreme Court, it's really interesting. The scenario that you laid out was one that I was also going with, and I talked to a Democrat the other day who I consider to be a very moderate, almost DLC type, and said that exact same scenario, like, here's the way that you get it done. You don't poke a finger in the eye to Republicans. You don't have a contentious fight, and then you go on and do other things. And he said, I can't, why would we even do that? What are you talking about? She's the president. She gets to pick who she wants to pick. Why would she put Merrick Garland? And I said, well, it just seems, absolutely not. Absolutely not. She should never do that. And I think those voices, and that's from a moderate. And so then I think, what is Elizabeth Warren? What is Bernie Sanders? What are others going to demand? Now, Republicans, you said all along that the president don't want to do it during a lame duck president. Fine. Here's the new president with her new choice. And so the pressure I agree with you that it would be better just like, let's get it done and let's not have the fight. I think the pressure on the left is going to be severe, and maybe even not just the far left, but even the middle left, for her getting who she wants, rather than just making it a Republican approved kind of candidate.
Yeah, we'll see how tough she is.
I know,
I
that's
think
right.
she's a pretty tough cookie, and I don't say that in a pejorative way at all. But we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and you do have a lot of Democrats already saying, if she's just won in a landslide, if she wins by as bigger margin than Barack Obama won in 2008, why is it that the first thing she has to do is start making concessions?
Right.
Right? Why is it that Republicans are going to say, you get even less
Right.
to work with than we gave Obama? How is that fair?
Because the Senate would be totally different than one Obama
And
had.
that's the answer to the
Yeah.
question. All right, let's go on the left side, you, sir, in the, yep, there we go.
Mike Macetic, I know the conventional wisdom is that domestic and economic affairs determine elections and politics, but I keep thinking that 4 years after the LBJ landslide, the Republicans began a 20-year run of the White House, and a large factor in that was Vietnam. You look out on the world now with all the banana peels out there, plus the fact that U.S. relative power in the world is at a relatively low point compared with 25 years ago. How much concentration is she going, assuming Clinton gets elected, is she going to have to focus on international events? And I know there's a bit of crystal balling here, but just how this affects the political situation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And given her background as Secretary of State, I think possibly the reason we talk about it less in these kinds of conversations is it is generally less of a factor in the electoral process, even if it's not the policy-making process. And it's also not something that presidents are as reliant on Congress to get done, right? They have much more free reign there. But, if Donald Trump had never happened, and this was a campaign between Hillary Clinton and a generic Republican, I think we'd be having much more of a litigation, not just of the Obama administration's foreign policy record, but also of the divisions between the Hillary Clinton style of foreign policy and the Barack Obama style, which she has at some points been openly critical of. So how do you see her making those kinds of decisions, and how much of a shadow is that going to cast over her potential presidency?
I guess I get my reaction, and I say this hesitantly because there's, pretty big percentage of people in this room would be better qualified to answer it than I am. But, I'd say the question is, would it be over or under 50% of her time? And the only reason why foreign affairs might be under 50% is that the domestic side is more time consuming because, as Molly said, you do have to work with Congress and you have to stroke people and all of that. With foreign policy, maybe you could be a little bit more efficient with your time and a little bit more decisive. But, I think it'll be fairly close to 50-50. But, the world is a much more disorderly place than it used to be. And I don't know. I tell you what, I'll call it a day there.
Basically, nobody knows. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Let's go to this man in the red bracelet there. Yep.
Al Milliken, AM Media. Do you have any observations about the ethical and moral dilemma serious, God-fearing Christians and people of faith are having regarding the choices they are faced with by the two major candidates, both who are coming from mainstream Protestant traditions?
Amy, you want to take that one?
Yeah, maybe I need to, you mean that event, are you specifically talking about the challenge for evangelicals, or you're talking for evangelical voters? No, for everybody.
Mainstream.
Just like, for a voter who has as their core value system, like a,
Integrity.
yeah, that, look, there's a reason that you have so many voters right now saying that they're voting for the least worst choice. There isn't the perfect candidate for them. And I think what we're seeing in some places where it's showing up, in a place like Utah, where you have a significant Mormon population, where it's showing up is a support for a third candidate, which is this guy, Evan McMullen, who is a Utah native and former security official who is he's anywhere from second, one poll he was in first place, right? That's where you put that's in this case, they're sending a statement that I want a Republican, but I don't want a Trump kind of Republican. I think in other places, you're going to see people just simply say they are holding their noses and using, other factors to determine their choice in vote. But I think it goes beyond people of religious faith. I think there are a lot of very disillusioned and disappointed voters out there. And this is the reality of the campaign that we're in. These are your two choices.
I'm trying to decide how much do I want to force the people in my office who will be answering the phones for the next 2 days and looking at our generic inbox. I try to stay in the middle and try hard. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. But, when I think of, and I came from a Southern Protestant background, when I think of religious conservatives, when I think of evangelical Christians, and when I think of sort of the value structure that they have historically, traditionally represented, and then I see a fair number of them supporting someone that's so far astray from Judeo-Christian values in so many ways. Talking about Donald Trump. I think, you know what, I don't really need to get a lecture on values from evangelical Christians from those folks anymore. I won't sit for it. Because to me, they're just so blinded by hatred of Hillary Clinton, someone who does have more of a, church attendance type background. I find it, when people are driven by hate as opposed to trying to feel like who actually reflects my values and the kind of ideal that we would want our leaders to be. I guess I'm going to save a lot of time by not having to listen to certain people anymore, because as far as I'm concerned, they're hypocrites. Wow.
All right. Let's take one more question from you in the back, sir. Then we'll let you all get out of here and take a shower.
Good afternoon. My name is Todd Wiggins. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I just had the great experience and opportunity to visit the Trump Hotel, so-called grand opening today. And I was fortunate to be part of the press, so I got a chance to go inside and see what was being said and all the hundreds of people that were there. But on my way out, I met a very interesting woman who was a very passionate Trump supporter, who I had an opportunity to interview. And she was amazing. I have to say, she was amazing in not only her passion, but she did not come across as being a stereotypical Trump supporter at all. She was actually very interesting and friendly and educated.
Do you have a question, sir?
So my question is it possible that in the future that we can try harder to understand each other's point of view, because sometimes there is a middle ground, and that we all are human and we believe in what we have to offer in this world. So can we come together at some point later on?
I don't know, I've lived in the middle ground all my life.
Yeah.
I think that's the big question after this election, though, given how many divides seem to have come to the foreground in the electorate, and not so much in the political process as in the actual social fabric of America. Do people have any desire to get along and be in community with each other? Or would they rather pull away and scapegoat and caricature?
Yeah, and is it unique to this campaign? I would argue no. I mean, this is the challenge just writ large for our societies, which is the way we treat each other on Twitter or on social media. That is not new to this. This did not come about simply because of this campaign. That's been there for a while. The community building that we hear about has been fraying. The isolating ourselves in little bubbles of comfort has been there for a long time too. And so I've been arguing for some time that the surprising thing about this election isn't that it's happening, it's that it took this long to happen. All the elements have been there for a long time. They're just all being put on display in stark relief. And so, we have to decide just how comfortable we are being in these places. And thus far, we've been quite happy staying in our little bubbles. And I think that that's where we will stay. We don't always have to be right? A campaign brings it all out to the fore, but I think we're going to go retreat back to the safe spaces where we've always been.
But aren't there some things that have been set free, that have been loose? I mean, I feel like this campaign is like we lifted up a rock and a whole bunch of stuff started crawling out from under it. You can't put that rock back down.
Yeah, we do.
And the question is, are we better off knowing what was under the rock?
I don't know. I just
Or
feel
were we
like
better
so
off
many
when we didn't
times
know?
I think we were better off with the rock still there.
Well, there's no going back.
I don't know. I feel like we do this with so many things, and clearly, I think what we're seeing now, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, is the reality that has been there since the founding of our country. We had this deep, deep, deep wound that we have never healed, that we just put a Band-Aid on, and then it oozes out, and we rip the Band-Aid off. We go, oh, that's really ugly. That's terrible. And then we put a Band-Aid back on, and then it oozes back over again. We've never fixed it. We've never gone to the underlying cause of that wound. And I don't think this campaign's going to do anything of any of those other wounds that we have there. I will say the one positive side, since it's been such a downer, but the other thing that I've been somewhat a tear about this sort of nostalgia for the past is that, look, the reality now is we are a diversifying country, and in that, you're getting a lot more diverse voices in the mix, which is the good part, okay? Somebody like me wasn't allowed to do things that I can do now 50 years ago, right? So that's fantastic. Voices that we've never heard before are now are part of the dialogue. The breakup of traditional media and traditional television networks is great. No, there's no match, right? One show that everybody in America watches, but there are a lot of shows out there with voices that were never part of the process before. That's what happens when you get an increasingly diverse society with open, to use a term that has now been thrown around in this campaign, open borders, okay? This is what you get. And some of it is really bad and ugly, but at its core, it's making sure that we don't just have one definitive voice trying to make the case how everybody should think and look and act. So that's the positive piece, I think, of what has come, not just of this campaign, but of this changing society.
On that profound
See?
note,
We'll do it
thank you
better.
everyone for coming. Thank you so much.